Good morning, everyone. This is Dean Karen Grosby from the College of Psychology, welcoming all of you. We know we have students, alumni, NSU faculty from across the university. Special welcome to all of you and to those at NSU from other offices and many, many community members. If I emphasize anything, for those of you who may be a little less familiar with Nova Southeastern University, that we're located in Davie, Florida, just outside of Fort Lauderdale. This university operates on a series of core values, and one of them is community. We're also classified by the Carnegie Foundation for community engagement. This is very, very important to us. And as you will see in the presentation today, having an impact in this area really requires all of the community partners pulling together, sharing their expertise in an effort to improve quality of life for our community. So with that said, a warm welcome, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Poland.
Thank you very much, Dean Grosby, and thank all of you for your interest in this topic. I imagine that you've had a myriad of emotions since the tragic shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And as someone who worked in the schools in Texas for a quarter century and have concentrated really on youth suicide prevention and school violence, I have many thoughts. Dr. Hubbard is here with me today. She's going to be monitoring the chat. We really want to hear from you, all of your ideas in terms of what we need to do to make sure this doesn't keep happening in our country. And this webinar is recorded. All of the comments and chats will be recorded. And if there's time, we'll answer a few questions at the end today. You know, I first testified before the US Congress on this subject in 1999. In one of my graduate classes recently, I made the students actually read that testimony. And one of them looked up and said, this was like 3 weeks before Columbine, you stressed these things. And then they said, you could have written this yesterday. Unfortunately, I imagine most of you would agree, progress and taking guns out of the hands of children and students and increasing mental health service in our schools has been slow. So what can you do? Because I'm going to guess that most of you are educators, maybe school counselors, school psychologists. Well, we can all get training on psychological first aid from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have excellent training in the areas of crisis intervention. In fact, one of NSU's graduates, Dr. Melissa Breimer, is in charge of one of their main programs. And we're really lucky that one of the staff members from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, Dr. Lane, came to work for us this year. And then in schools, the National Association of School Psychologists has done a lot in developing the PREPARE curriculum. So please get trained in crisis intervention. Now, in addition to the NAS PREPARE, of course, there's a critical incidents stress management, which is out of the work of Jeffrey Mitchell. There's also the National Organization of Victims Assistance, which was training I received. And then I led a number of their teams after tragic school shootings around the country. But you need to have your voice heard. Ask, is there a school safety task force in the community where you reside? And maybe most importantly, is input from professionals and community members welcome? Have your voice heard about what needs to be done to prevent school shootings. You know, I've been at this a long time. I responded to my first school shooting 4 decades ago. and I've now responded to 17 different school shootings. I've seen the pain of the parents, students, staff members, and the entire community. But what is the motivation of a school shooter? Primarily, they're after glory or getting even. Sometimes it's both. And our media, unfortunately, does give them glory. And school safety has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the question is, of course, really, where would spending that money actually make the most difference? And maybe you'll weigh in on that in the chat. So school shootings are up this year. And when we have one, it really rocks the psyche of America. One school shooting is unacceptable, but we must work on the prevention of shootings everywhere. There have been many more mass shootings in America since the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. Thankfully, there's not been another one at a school, but we need to do something about gun violence everywhere. Every one of us need to be alert for the warning signs of someone planning a shooting. And in particular, many times the perpetrator posted clues online about their plans, their location, they're attempting to get the weapons. They now have the weapons. They've provided a lot of details, and all of us have to work together to stop it. And I would imagine some of you are parents. You know, there's something I wish I could say to every parent in America, which is your kid cannot joke about a school shooting. They can't say it impulsively. They can't post it. If they do, those consequences may be quite severe. And school safety, in my opinion, it's primarily an inside job. We got to get a commitment from the student body first, then the entire faculty, parents, and the entire community. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how we can get students themselves more involved in safety at their school. Now, maybe most of you could agree, holding parents accountable when their kid took their gun to school and shot classmates and teachers. Could this possibly be something both sides of the great debate about guns in America could agree on? To this point, we never have. I believe back in the 80s, if we'd held adults accountable, there would have been far fewer school shootings committed by student perpetrators. Now, please don't misunderstand. I am not questioning an adult's right to own a gun. I'm simply saying with that right comes a responsibility to secure that gun in your home. And of course, we'll all have to follow Oxford, Michigan. We know that those parents who bought that gun for their son and did not securely store it, we know they've been in jail since last November. So it'll be interesting to see what the final outcome might be. It's a question of responsibility, not a question of ownership. I'd be remiss today not to emphasize to you that we have some definition problems in terms of what constitutes a school shooting. If it's 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning in a high school parking lot, is that a school shooting? If it's at a sporting event, is that a school shooting? Most school shootings actually occur in parking lots or they occur at sporting events. But when we have a school shooting inside the building, then the consequences and the body count is much more severe. There's evidence, some researchers out of Arizona State University have indicated there's a contagious nature to mass shootings in America. When we cover it extensively, sadly, we could probably expect another mass shooting within 2 weeks. And of course, we had the tragedy at the supermarket in Buffalo, New York. And shortly after that, you had the shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And this is something that is particularly troubling to me. For the first time ever, we have data saying that more kids every year in America die of gun deaths than are killed in car accidents. So what's that actually mean? We've made progress, thankfully, in reducing car accident deaths of children. And maybe we need to apply some of those same strategies to try to do something to reduce the gun deaths for children in America, which Everytown USA, for example, refers to approximately 3,000 children in America die a gun death every year. That's counting a suicide using a gun, that's counting being a homicide victim and having been shot, and it's counting dying in accidental gun death as well. So in April of this year, I'm really sorry to tell you that a disturbed adult opened fire on the Burke School in Washington, D.C., firing over 200 rounds from the 5th floor of a building across the street. By some miracle, only 6 people were actually injured, and all of them are going to survive. So I led sessions for the staff. So important to help the staff first. I led sessions for the parents as well. And there's 2 key questions that are really important. And they are, what would help you feel safer now? And sometimes people need to see some things that are different to help with that sense of safety. And then something that is very important is to always be asking about existing sources of support. Who or what has helped you when you've had to deal with something sad before? Who or what is helping you now? I'm very pleased to tell you that everybody at the Burke School did go back to the campus this year, and the headmaster provided extensive support for staff, students, and parents. And all the students were asked those 2 questions before they returned to campus. There's been a lot of recommendations over really several decades saying that every school needs a multidisciplinary threat assessment team. And that's something you can ask your local school board, district, or local school principal. So who should be on this multidisciplinary team? According to the Secret Service, a mental health representative, a law enforcement representative, an administrator, like a school principal, and teachers who know the kid in question who supposedly made a threat, all of them meeting together. I've always found the wisest decisions in education are made by a team of people. So please start putting some of your ideas about preventing school violence or supporting communities that have experienced a school shooting. Please start putting those comments in the chat box. So I already mentioned their definition problems. And I want to give you several sources so you can research on your own and look at the data for the last few decades, the data for the 21-22 school year. And Education Week in particular said in the 4 years since Parkland that we've had 118 K-12 school shootings. 26 occurred in the current school year. We have more than 130,000 schools in America. One school shooting is unacceptable. but schools actually do remain very safe places for children. Overwhelming grief and emotions after a school shooting. There's a need to identify immediate sources of support. As I said earlier, see something that's different. By the way, there are no magic words. You know, as a psychologist, you know what I avoid saying? I understand. You've had people say that to you way too quickly. And you spend the next 15 minutes explaining how they do not understand. And we also are quick to say, it's going to be okay. It is never going to be okay for families and friends that lost a loved one in a school shooting. And as one Parkland survivor said, you learn to live with it. You try to keep the grief in its own lane so it does not consume you. And I do believe we have to tell children the truth. We need to use developmentally appropriate language. And with young children, we give them some facts and then we wait to see what questions they might have for us. There's a strong desire to make changes. Families who lost loved ones, they don't want it to ever happen to anybody else's partner, friend, or anybody else's kid. And as a result, they're working hard to make meaningful changes. And I cannot overemphasize this. I've been around a long time, and it saddens me to tell you, schools and communities almost always underestimate the impact of the tragedy. They're in it for the long haul, and they need to make sure that political twists and turns don't interfere with kids, staff members, families, all getting the help that they need. And schools should never turn down sources of assistance. And at the simplest level, I wish I could get every superintendent out there to think in advance. Who would we call on and why if we had a staggering tragedy? Make those decisions ahead of time. Help the school staff first. Help them deal with all of their emotions and their sense that their safety and security has been taken away, and hold a meeting for parents. And what are the typical reactions that children actually have to a tragedy? They regress academically, behaviorally. They have nightmares, sleeping problems, and worries about the future. Those aren't the unusual ones. Those are the pretty much every single time. And you want all the adults to respond with patience, tolerance, structure, love, and realize that this is going to take a long time as people slowly move forward to being able to manage what has happened. And I'm a big believer in resuming and reopening schools as quickly as is reasonably possible. I know at the crime scene, I know there's things that have to be cleaned up, but you know, ironically, last week, I returned to the West Side Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. That was 1998, when two boys that were 11 and 13 killed 5 and they wounded 10. You know, I led a national crisis team there. We resumed school after a day and a half, and every kid who was not in the hospital came back to school to get the help that they need. When we cancel school for weeks and weeks, we leave kids largely left to their own devices because their parents have to get up, leave the house, and go to work. So in recent years, there's been more of a tendency to have kids out of school for weeks, but they really are almost desperate to be back with each other and back with their teachers. So you help the teachers first, you help the parents, and then you try to get kids back into a routine, which is being back at school. We're going to talk about the circles of vulnerability model that I learned from some psychologists in Israel. I think you'll find it a very helpful way to try to figure out who might need our help the most. Think of it like a psychological triage. And then Congress, after Columbine, appropriated millions of dollars, schools emergency response to violence grants. These are really easy to get. And I know here in Parkland, I was advocating use those project serve funds, move the trailers onto campus. You're going to get and are going to need a lot more mental health professionals, but nobody wants to be crying in the library. Everybody would like to be in a private office or in a private trailer. So I've never gone into a school that has like 3 or 4 offices sitting vacant, waiting to have more social workers, counselors, or school psychologists. So that's why those trailers have been so helpful to many school communities. And then recovery needs to be somebody's job, their sole job, to chart the slow path of recovery for the school district. And obviously you're thinking of many attributes you would want that recovery coordinator to have. And then I've heard over and over from staff members who were shot, don't treat everybody the same. And I've heard from students, quit changing my counselor. It feels like I'm starting over every time as you give me a new counselor. So that means we've got to plan and get the additional mental health personnel there and keep them there, so people feel like they're moving forward with the same counselor instead of starting over every few weeks with a new one. And then there are many triggering events. What about the birthday the victim would have had? What about the anniversary of the tragedy? What about the trial if the perpetrator survived? What about the sentencing? And by the way, the families are never all going to agree on what is the appropriate sentence. In fact, right here in South Florida, there's a lot of debate about whether that perpetrator should receive the death penalty or not. And there's graduations. There are various ceremonies at school that obviously make people think about what happened. And I'm sorry to say that suicide is the second leading cause of death for middle school and high school age students in this country. Suicide prevention in schools is my other highest priority besides school safety and school violence prevention and intervention. So any community that's experienced a school shooting needs to increase their suicide prevention efforts. And it will always be my hope that remodeling will occur, not tearing down a school building. I remember being asked this at Columbine by the superintendent. What do you think about tearing down Columbine High School? What do I think? You're going to glorify the actions of 2 disturbed young men beyond anything imaginable by tearing down the school. I always like to use Norris Hall at Virginia Tech as an example. So what they do with Norris Hall, that's where most of the deaths occurred. It's now a peace center. Nobody goes to classes there anymore, but the building has a purpose, which is trying to make a difference in the future. So the Israeli psychologist basically used these 3 circles: geographic proximity, who was right at the campus that day, who was close to where the shooting occurred, who lost a best friend or their favorite teacher in the shooting, who had their own unique trauma history. And maybe the simplest example I can give is imagine two boys are in a car accident. DeMar was driving. His best friend, Roberto, survived. So I just gave you for Roberto geographic proximity, psychosocial proximity. What if I tell you Roberto's mom is dying of cancer right now? That's the intersection of those three circles. I found it really difficult to get schools to actually look at the intersection of these circles. Because when you do, of course, you realize there are going to be people that are going to need our help, not for days and weeks, but for months and maybe even for years. These same psychologists gave us what they call the 60-20-20 rule. 60% of us, no matter how staggering the tragedy, we're going to be okay with our existing support systems, family, faith, friends, for example. 20% minor problems. But tragically, we would expect 20% to have major problems. You probably never read about Greg Barnes, the Columbine basketball star, who lost best friends in the shooting, who was standing next to Coach Sanders when he got shot. Greg Barnes hung himself on the first anniversary, an example of a kid who just didn't get enough help. So what are the parents and the families of the victims calling for? Mr. Scotter's first daughter, Rachel, died at Columbine High School, said, we got to have more religion in our schools. In his testimony in front of Congress, he chastised them for stripping us of our heritage, our ability to pray in schools. Claire Davis died at Arapahoe High School. Her parents said, we won't sue the school if they just tell us the truth about what they knew about the perpetrator who killed our daughter. By the way, Colorado passed the Claire Davis Safety Act, which removed the automatic immunity that school administrators in Colorado previously enjoyed. You know, I met Suzanne Wilson in Jonesboro, Arkansas. She was tireless in her efforts to try to do something to take guns out of the hands of children. And the family that lost their son at the shooting in the Denver theater, they started no notoriety for perpetrators. And many of these families called for better parenting and supervision. And maybe at the simplest level, if a parent walks into their kid's room and they see the bulletin board is a shrine to school shooters, they need to reach out for help. Reducing violence in the media. That makes me think of three girls who died in Paducah, Kentucky, another place where I went. Casey, Jessica, and Nicole. Their parents formed a foundation. They sued the maker of a point and shoot video game. They sued the maker of a movie that graphically depicted a school shooting. Their lawsuits weren't successful, but they certainly raised some interesting questions. School safety audits makes me think of my friends Michelle Gay and Alyssa Parker, who lost their first graders at Sandy Hook Elementary School. They very much believe in a partnership between police and school officials, and safety audits should be done in every single building in America, and increasing connections with all students. So some of you are parents. I've got a simple question I'd like you to ask your kids. Who is your go-to adult at school? When do I get the most concerned? When a kid can't identify a go-to trusted adult at school. There are some of the most well-known foundations started by parents and families in memory of their loved one who was killed in a shooting. Yeah, I love you guys out of Bailey, Colorado. They do a lot with reunification. Sandy Hook Promise has been incredibly prolific in so many ways with many programs. And a number of foundations have been started right here in South Florida. The Oliver family started Change the Ref organization. Lori Alladeth, who's now on our school board, started Make Our Schools Safe. She also got Alyssa's law passed in New Jersey and Florida, which requires schools to basically have a panic button that can notify local police immediately. We could spend a long time on all the important work of those foundations, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the Secret Service now. And the National Threat Assessment Center made recommendations for schools. Some of those we've already touched on, but really stressing a shared commitment. School safety involves the entire community. Law enforcement, civic leaders, school leaders, and as I said earlier, students themselves, staff members, parents. And then the importance of these well-trained threat assessment teams with a designated leader and various disciplines represented. And we've got to pay attention to the online media posts of kids that have made threats in our schools and communities. And we need to develop a positive relationship, if at all possible, with their parents. If a kid's posted about a school threat and they have guns available in their homes, we need to convince the parents to secure those guns. There is their recommendation about a go-to trusted adult. Schools need increased resources to help troubled students and a culture of connection. Schools need a means for anonymous reporting. Florida, after Parkland, created not only the Office of Safe Schools, but the Fortify Florida app. Most of the time, when I ask school employees and I ask students about the Fortify Florida app, I show it to them on my phone. Most of the time I hear, oh, I didn't know about that. Every student in the state needs to know about the Fortify Florida app, and posters need to be in every classroom. I cannot overemphasize removing a student from school does not eliminate risk. I think you can all immediately think of examples where, yeah, effectively they were removed from school, but they came back with guns, maybe going through an unlocked gate, maybe finding an unlocked door to the building. So when a kid makes a threat, we should view it as they need help. It's a red flag. So now a question for you. I went over the Secret Service recommendations. What are we doing in schools in about half of our states that was not recommended by NTAC? In fact, you're not going to find a single professional school association or a law enforcement association that has ever endorsed arming teachers. Yes, we're doing it in about 28 of our states. So maybe you'll weigh in, put something in the chat box. Do you think arming teachers is the answer? And then I gave an example from Florida. They expanded the Guardian program. The legislature voted on it the exact same day that the school resource officer gun actually went off, firing through a classroom wall. Thankfully, no one was hurt. That was the guy with hundreds of hours of training. So the NTAC report, and we need to do more of these. And in particular, we need to study student shooters separately from other mass shooters in America. But this study, the perpetrators ranged from 7th through 12th grade. They attacked their own school with weapons that came from their homes. They were primarily white. They were 100% males in those 41 attacks that were studied. They exhibited concerning behaviors. They felt mistreated. They were angry. They wanted revenge. They were bullied. They were suicidal. They had a history of discipline problems and a real fascination with previous school shooters. Unfortunately, Columbine set the blueprint. And we even have kids that want to make a pilgrimage to visit sites where school shootings have occurred. Here are a couple of quotes from the founders of Sandy Hook Promise. Mark Barden, a deranged sociopath going to school with the planned outcome of suicide does not care if school staff are armed or not. Nicole Hockley, who lost her son, Dylan. School safety focuses too much on the moment of school violence as opposed to stopping it in the first place. So if you Googled right now, safest school in America, you would find a principal and a superintendent in Indiana proudly saying, all we have to do is push a button. We could fill the hallways with smoke and the bad guys won't be able to see where they're going. And do you really think that's the best use of our tax dollars? To be able to fill hallways with smoke? Have we really reached that point? So the National Association of School Psychologists, and I'm proud to tell you, 20 years ago, I was the president of that organization. They've taken a stance, and they took that stance years ago. They support gun background checks and extreme risk protection orders, a ban on fully assault weapons, evidence-based threat assessment, policy and practice in our schools, eliminating the Dickey Amendment. If you don't know, that passed in 1996 and basically resulted in the federal government not studying gun violence as a public health issue. NASP is opposed to arming teachers and permitting open or concealed carry at school. In summation, NASP says nobody at school should have a gun except a police officer. I thought you might be interested in, there's been quite a search for answers. Those answers have not been very satisfying. But Santana High School, I led a team there also. So Andy Williams, who will be sitting in prison for a minimum of 50 years, and he killed 2 and he wounded 13. There you see his comments about how he was hurting. He wanted bullying to stop. I wanted one person to tell me bringing the gun from my home to school was a bad idea. And then he says something about feeling powerful for the first time in his life. Dr. Langman, and I interviewed Dr. Langman, and it's available at our website. There is Dr. Langman's website. There's the Suicide and Violence Prevention website. Dr. Langman spent a lot of time studying school shooters. 3 books he's written on the subject. And he basically says there's 3 types. These would go to, I'd like to make the point, school shooters are not normal kids. They were mentally ill. But I'd be remiss today not to say the vast majority of mentally ill people in this country are never going to harm anybody else. But Langman classified them into 3 types: the psychopath, the psychotic school shooter, and the traumatized school shooter. These were kids that dramatically needed psychological interventions. And with my colleague here at NSU, Dr. Ferguson, we wrote a book last year, Lessons Learned from School Shooting, Perspectives from the United States. You know, maybe the biggest question, because the Secret Service says 81% of school shooters told at least one person what they were planning to do. So the question is really, why don't kids come forward and tell adults if somebody is threatening a school shooting? Well, the literature says they didn't want to get involved. They feared retaliation. They did not think it could happen, or they have been conditioned not to tell. Let's see if you can finish my sentence. Snitches get what? Stitches. Isn't that unfortunate? You all know that. Don't we wish every kid knew see something, say something? Every kid had a go-to trusted adult. We need to find out if kids have trusted adults in our schools. And I remember being in a classroom at Jersey Village High School. I had all the desks in a circle. Everybody was very aware that at 2:30 the day before, a kid grabbed his backpack. Unfortunately, he had a gun in it. The gun went off. A girl next to him was shot in the leg. So we all know she's going to survive. She's still in the hospital. He is in jail. You know, at first I thought it was going pretty well, but about 4 kids in a row said, that was so serious. I mean, she could have been killed. I could have been killed, but I don't think I would tell an adult if I saw a gun in this campus tomorrow. Not a single kid in that room argued with that line of thinking. I think most kids would tell us, but nobody was willing to argue with all those saying, no matter what, you never tell. We've got to look for warning signs. Fascination with guns, violence, bombs, trying to get a weapon, a hit list, rehearsal, planning, posting plans or videos, talking about a school shooting, looking for others to join their plans. So what are my main suggestions? Parents got to pay attention to what's going on in their adolescent's life. They need to let their kids experience consequences. They need to pay attention when schools say, your kid needs some help, more than we can actually provide at school. They need to secure the weapons in their homes. They need to monitor social media. Schools need to take every threat seriously. Schools need comprehensive suicide and bullying prevention programs. Every school should have a safety task force. Students should be a part of it. We need to survey staff and students to find out what their thoughts are about connections, bullying, school safety. What are their ideas? I wrote the student safety pledges for my old district, Cypress Fairbanks. There's an elementary version, there's a secondary version. So what's the floor plan activity? Well, basically imagine all of you were my 9th graders. I come in today to my homeroom and I say, here's the floor plan of our school. Shade in any area where you don't feel safe. It's almost like we just need to ask students. Well, let's be more sophisticated. This floor plan is before the first bell. Where don't you feel safe? This one is during the school day. This third one is after school, extracurricular activity time. What are you going to find out? Probably a problem in locker rooms, a problem in restrooms, maybe a problem in stairwells. Maybe the science department teachers don't get out in the hallway between classes. We need to get information from students. And then Sydney, New York example. So the middle school principal says, here's what I do. At a staff meeting, I put up a picture one at a time of every single kid in my school. And I go, who is that? Her name's Lakeisha. Okay, what's Lakeisha involved in here in our school? Nothing? Who's going to meet with Lakeisha? We got to get her involved in some school activities. And my partner was the associate principal of Cy-Fair High School. It was huge at the time, 135 homerooms. So Donna had every homeroom elect a school safety representative. She met with all 135 of them every week. They had t-shirts made that identified them as the source for school safety, the source and the force for school safety. And there were scripts for the homeroom teachers. They had to discuss school safety several times a week in classes. And there were hot button issues that would be sent to the associate principal's office immediately. And we put those little mailboxes at the end of the hallways. This was before we had the sophistication of anonymous reporting. And I still remember looking at one of the mailboxes, and the idea was that kids would put notes in the mailbox about things that were brewing. And the AP and security would come along, check those mailboxes between every class period. And I remember that concerned person reporting was actually misspelled on one of the mailboxes. I don't think there's an S anywhere in that word concerned. Other suggestions that are so basic, but are these really being done in every school in America? Lock all but the front door. Even better, have a double set of front doors and have everybody met by a staff member to determine, do they have a good reason to be here before they're buzzed in through that second door? Can every classroom teacher in America lock the classroom door? Is there an identified hard corner in every classroom in America away from doors and windows where there's space for all the staff and students to get in that corner? And then safety audits, I already mentioned, as well as panic buttons. So here's some questions. This is a little bit of your take home. Find out, does your local school have a threat assessment team? Florida passed a law, Senate Bill 7030, right after the Parkland tragedy, requiring every school district in the state to make sure every school had a threat assessment team capable of assessing threats of violence towards others, threats of violence towards self. Dr. Dewey Cornell from the University of Virginia and myself did that training. We did 3 weeks of training, 4 days for everybody. Every school district in the state had to send personnel. The idea was, you're going to become the trainer for your individual school district. Ask, how often is school safety discussed in faculty meetings? Is information provided to parents about school safety? And is the input from parents and caregivers welcome in the school? How are students involved in school safety? Does your local school have mental health professionals in the ratio to students recommended by the various professional associations? By the way, I've become a big fan of the Violence Project. I have their book over on my shelf. And the Violence Project says that currently the ratio of school psychologists to students in this country is 1 to 1,500. So what does the National Association of School Psychologists say it should be? 1 to 500. What's the ratio of counselors to students across America? 1 to 450. What does ASCA say that ratio should be? 1 to 250. Now, over decades, we've had people call for more mental health services in schools, which I very much support. We got to fund it. We got to attract people into those important professions. We need more school psychologists, more school social workers, and more school counselors. And we need to attract them into the profession and retain them. Oh, there's the Violence Project. I very much encourage you to visit their website. They've pretty much echoed many of the things that I've already talked about today, but they stress a common denominator for mass shooters in our country: childhood trauma. And they raise an interesting question. Do we need to change how we consume, produce, and share violent content in America? So as you're thinking of questions and making those comments, I have a couple of concluding thoughts for you. A student threat of violence should be viewed as a red flag that they need help. A quote from Craig Scott. Craig Scott hid underneath the library table at Columbine High School. Isaiah next to him was shot and killed. He lost his older sister, Rachel, in that shooting. In our schools, we must reach the unreachable. Pretty profound statement for a graduating high school senior years ago. We have disillusioned students in every school in America. We need to figure out a way to get them more involved. And every school, it should be a place that all kids like, where they feel connected, where they would never think of hurting anyone. Whatever we need to do to make that happen, that is our task. We need to study school shooters separately from other mass shooters. I think you would all agree. Thoughts and prayers have not been enough over decades. You need to make your voice heard. And how can you do that? Well, there was actually an open letter that I just saw this week to Congress demanding gun reform now. All of those education, counseling, psychology, and social work organizations signed on, imploring Congress to do something. How can you be heard? Support Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence. There is the website. Support the call to action to prevent gun violence. This is at the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. And I've become a really big fan of ResistBot. You can actually go to that website, and in a few simple steps, you can send your view, whatever it is, on how you think we can prevent the next school shooting. You can send it to your congressional representatives. How could you help the Uvalde schools and community? The school district is open an account, and donations can be mailed or they can be sent through Zelle. And Dr. Hubbard, I'm going to leave this up, so hopefully some of you will reach out and provide some funds, because we know this is going to take a long time. It is never going to be okay in that community. But how can we make sure that all of those affected families get the support they need over the long haul? So, Dr. Hubbard, we have any questions or comments, things in our, we have a few minutes.
We do have quite a few, so I'm going to go into some of the questions first. One of the first questions we had was, I was thinking that school shooters were living in terrible pain and suffering. That's not true?
Well, we do know that the majority of school shooters were suicidal. For the most part, mass shooters in America don't expect to survive. It's either going to be suicide by cop or it's going to be suicide at their own hand. So I would agree, and this would go to Langman's category of traumatized, depressed school shooters, but others are psychotic or they're psychopaths, but they do pretty much all share. They know they're not going to get away with this. And many of them died by suicide or were killed by police that day.
And then one of our participants had, I think, wanted some clarification on the parent accountability piece. So questioning maybe more training for parents offered by schools.
So, well, first of all, I'd like to take a moment and mention what are called child access prevention laws. About 27 states have those laws holding parents accountable if it was your gun. But for the most part, prosecutors do not enforce those laws. Now, so accountability, you know what I think after 40 years, it's like parents know when they have a disturbed kid, but they can be very high on denial. And the mental health interventions can be very difficult to get. If you're poor in this country and you don't have insurance, well, then getting mental health services for someone in your family can be quite difficult. And I think most people would be very surprised to know that school counselors primarily do testing, clerical, and scheduling. School psychologists, we know, spend most of our time on special education assessments. So until we actually increase those personnel, that means their ability to really provide mental health interventions in schools is incredibly limited.
We also had one of our participants asking, do you think there should be more restrictions on violent video games that tend to decrease the inhibition of kids and tend to practice mass violence?
All right, great question. So there is a guy out there named Lieutenant Colonel Grossman who really believes that video games desensitize our young people to violence. But when you actually start searching through the literature, it's really hard to find much of an effect. And maybe I should say it affects maybe a few kids, but you know, the answers to all of this, there's no simple answer. In fact, as I was going over what many of the parents have advocated for, I suspect that most of you would agree with all of those. So we really need to approach this from many viewpoints and not think about there's an absolute simple answer, but we do have to do more than we've ever done before.
Another one of our participants asked, are you able to share the best suicide protocol you have seen for public schools? So they also stated that they've seen many, but most aren't simple enough, or they use outdated things like safety contracts.
Well, Dr. Hubbard, you should have answered that, because on our website, we have the Florida steps developed right here at NSU. Florida School Toolkit for Educators to Prevent Suicide. You Google it, you got it. You can use anything in there that will help you, or you can go to the website for the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office.
Another one of our participants asked, is there any research around the effectiveness of having SROs in schools? I know the Marjorie Stoneman Act in Florida requires it, but I'm skeptical that it's actually effective.
So it's research about exactly what again, Dr. Hubbard?
Having school resource officers in schools.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I think we do know that the SRO in Parkland is still facing criminal charges for hiding, right? We also know that in 2 of the 3 worst school shootings in America, Parkland and Uvalde, extreme criticism of the police. I believe we need more answers, more research. We're already reading about different states have immediately said more cops in schools. And please know that I'm not opposed to that, but the targeted study of school violence from the U.S. Secret Service said, for the most part, shootings were over before law enforcement actually did anything. So that's a great question. And I don't know that we have the answer, but I'll go back to something I said 23 years ago. The kid doesn't have a gun. They're not going to shoot anybody at school. It's that simple. And if a kid's got mental health problems, we need to figure out a way to get them treatment.
We had another question. Do you have an app or program you can recommend to families to monitor teen social media usage?
There are actually a lot of those. And I would go to an organization website, fosi.org, and through Dr. Perez, I think we could provide something to all the participants. I've actually done several webinars about social media, screen time, what can parents do? So yes, there are a number of apps, and Dr. Perez, let's see if I put something together, could that be mailed out to all the participants?
Yes, we could do a follow-up email with anything you'd like to put on there.
That'd be great. Well, we'll definitely do that.
Another question we had, how can we hold the gun sellers and the ammunition seller accountable, and would that help reduce the availability of both guns and ammo?
Okay, so I don't know if you're all familiar with Remington Arms just settled with 8 Sandy Hook families for $73 million. Gun manufacturers have enjoyed federal immunity. That case was before the Supreme Court in the state of Connecticut. So there's, at least for the first time, there is this thought, maybe gun manufacturers could be held accountable. And the real issue, that was about the Bushmaster. The real issue was how they marketed the Bushmaster. Be a man, only one way to be a man, have a Bushmaster assault rifle. So that was central to the case, and Remington Arms settling. But I have no way to predict, will this start a trend? So, and I want to thank everybody who was on the webinar today. And Dr. Perez, they will get a copy of the PowerPoint, as well as we'll put something together that has to do with apps that'll help parents have a little more insight into the social media presence of their children.
Thank you, Dr. Pullen, again for this very informative session. We will do, individuals that participate in this session will get a quick follow-up thank you. There's also going to be a survey. We encourage you to fill that out. And in the following days, we'll send a follow-up email as you requested, and we will include the PowerPoint if you desire. It will be in an attachment, so be aware that it sometimes gets caught in spam blocks. So look out for that email later this week.
All right, thank everybody.
And thank you again for attending this webinar. We are the Nova Southeastern University College of Psychology. We have undergraduate, graduate programs, and also a number of clinics. We encourage you to visit our website, psychology.nova.edu. Have a great and safe day.